I've entitled today's talk, Cinderella No Longer, Taking Hope to the Ball. Let me just try and explain that slightly weird title. Because faith and love aren't really ugly sisters, are they? That's the idea. Faith and love aren't really ugly sisters, so getting along, hope to come to the ball is just a reminder that for quite a long time we've had quite a big discourse about faith. There are lots of books written about faith, lots of discussions about faith, and of course there are lots of discussions about love or charity. But when it comes to hope, everything goes very quiet. And it seems to sort of shrink back into being something, oh yes, well, yes, there's hope as well. That would be nice. Sort of wishful thinking, really. It would be awfully nice if such and such were the case, but it isn't. But I hope that one day it might be. You know what I mean? And I want to suggest that actually the theological virtue of hope is something quite other than wishful thinking, and really rather an important dimension of Christianity. Let's just start with a caricature or picture. When I had the privilege of being amongst you here in this church 4 years ago, we talked about the gift of faith. And I remember trying to bring out the notion that faith is something which someone else produces in you. Whereas typically we tend to think of faith as a demand for a particular act of belief. Do you have faith? You must have faith or else you'll go to hell, right? Oh yes, I'll believe, whoops. Fire a moon rocket off to the moon or some perhaps existing planet in the hopes that perhaps it will get there. The emotional blackmail, you must believe or you will go to hell. But we know in real life that if we actually have faith in someone as a normal act of relationship, it's because that someone has shown themselves towards us in such a way as to enable us to relax, so that the appropriate emotional correlate for faith, rather than work up, moonshot, is relaxation. Example, Aunt Mabel. When I'm in England I use Aunt Matilda, but since Matilda has so many connotations in Australia I can't use. Aunt Mabel knows you, she likes you, she's aware of your foibles, she's been watching you for quite a long time, she's well aware of what you're like, you're going to tea with her. You don't need to pretend very much when you're with Aunt Mabel. Why? Because you know she likes you. So when you are with her, you're able to let the mask down, let your hair down, be seen for who you are, and respond genuinely. Because you know she likes you, she has produced in you a disposition to relax in her presence. Wouldn't that be right? And that, of course, is what the gift of faith is about. God giving us the disposition to relax. Because we know he likes us, we can relax in his presence. It's exactly the reverse of the, if you don't believe, I won't like you, which is just another demand, just another form of emotional blackmail. Okay? But in the self-starting version, the modern individualist version, we're very tempted to fall back on, faith is something I must somehow produce from in here. And if I don't, I'm somehow failing. Rather than remembering that it's a disposition produced in us by someone else who enables us to relax. And again, when we think in the individualist model of charity or love, we say, yes, there's faith, hope, and love, and the most important thing is love. So even if you can't make the moonshot, and even if things are pretty hopeless, at least love! Because it's the Miss Piggy of rhetoric. Love! She's busy emotionally blackmailing you. If nothing else works. So meaning, stretch your will in some way towards the bastards and attempt to be nice to them or something. So faith, a moonshot, love, a stretching of the will, and somewhere in the middle there, hope, which is usually, or very often comes across in our world, as I say, as a form of wishful thinking. Things don't look great, but at least let's try and pump up a bit of emotion with the possibility that things might get better. That's the individual one. None of these is to understand a theological virtue. The whole purpose of what the medievals referred to as a theological virtue is that it's a stable disposition. That's what a virtue is, isn't it? A good habit, a stable disposition produced in you by God. Mostly stable dispositions are produced in us by other people. Other people teach us how, for instance, to walk, how to speak other languages. We find ourselves inducted into doing things stably. Well, faith is, as in the case of Aunt Mabel, but in this case it's God, someone producing in you a stable disposition to be able to relax in knowing that you're loved, and because of that, being free to start flourishing and being yourself. To be able actually to return love because no one is making a demand of you. It's the difference, for those of you who are familiar with North Korea, your great neighbor, quite a long way to the north. It's the difference between having to take a bunch of flowers to a procession for Kim Jong-un, because if you don't, you'll have your head chopped off, and being so in love with Kim Jong-un's wonderful haircut that you feel an overwhelming longing to give him a bunch of flowers. There's all the difference in the world between doing so out of being bullied and doing so out of love, right? Okay. Now, when it comes to the theological virtue of hope, as I say, we're left with the world, usually with the world of wishful thinking. What I want to suggest is that actually hope is much more objective than that. Let me give an example. My mum died last year. It was in due time, so no great tragedy. When she died, she left a will. In the will, she left a property to be divided amongst my brother, my sister, and myself. I don't know whether it's what happens here, but in the United Kingdom, Her Majesty, the same Her Majesty that you all know and love, gets to swipe 40% of everybody's property. They're called death duties, right? Do you have that here? No? Her Majesty has a lighter paw on your... In fact, we shouldn't encourage Tony Abbott to follow that example. A lighter paw. But anyhow, Her Majesty or her appointed representatives or her elected representatives swipe 40% from whatever it is that anybody leaves anybody. And after that, the remainder will be divided between my brother, my sister, and myself. Now, the interesting thing is that from the moment my mum died, that was ours, by law. That property was ours. Wasn't anybody else's. Her Majesty's government take their sweet time to work through their probate, as I believe it's called. Do you have that here as well? They take their sweet time to sort out all the paperwork. But even while they're sorting it out, that property is in fact ours, my brother's, my sister's, my own. Which means that even as they're taking their time, I'm not in a space of wishful thinking as regards that property. I'm in fact already starting to adjust my sights and my relationship with other people according to that which is coming upon me. Does that make sense? We all know what that does. We actually start having to rethink things and what we're going to be able to do, how we relate to other people. It actually starts to come upon us. This is not a feeling, a subjective feeling that goes up or down. This is actually part of how we are related to other people. Someone has done something, my mum has died, which has created an assurance of something coming towards me. And that actually alters me. Does that make sense? Why I wanted to bring that out to you is because when we talk about the gift of hope, we are talking about something objective, not something subjective. An assurance given by someone else that begins to alter me. Does that make sense? I think it's very, very important that we remember that, because each one of the theological virtues is relational. Someone else gives an assurance which produces hope in me. Someone else is there loving me, and I am able to relax. Because someone else loves me, I can relax enough to begin to love. So each one, faith, hope, and charity, before it's something in here, is something which someone does to me, and is producing a different, what we would call character in me, an objective character, a set of dispositions that are, in fact, stable dispositions that are quite objective. Now, why is that important? Because it means that up until now, we've tended to regard faith, hope, and charity as though they were intellectual notions. Whereas what I want to suggest is that they're the shape of what the Greeks called it, huiothesia. And we typically translate that as sonship, and then quickly add daughterhood to show that we're not sexist. Do you know what I mean? Which is very difficult. It's a difficult notion, isn't it? Because the notion of being sons or daughters of God. It's a gendered term in English. I sometimes use the word bairndom. Do you remember the old, in some parts of Scotland they still use, and in some parts of Yorkshire, they still use a word that comes to us from the Vikings. A bairn. A wee bairn. Have you heard that? Okay, it has the advantage of being gender indistinct. So, our bairndom in God. Why is it a difficult notion? Because otherwise we could use child, but child has a sense of minority, doesn't it? Being too little, but not really. Whereas the purpose of being a son or daughter, a bairn in that sense, is being an insider in the life of. It proposes, it's the language of the heir, someone who is the son and heir, which is why it was sexist in the old days, because daughters weren't allowed to be heirs. So, the notion of being on the inside of God's life, that's what sonship, daughterhood, bairndom is all about. And being stretched into your inheritance. So the gifts of faith, hope, and love, rather than being separate things from this process of becoming a son or a daughter, they're the content of it. What does it look like to be an insider on the inside of the life of God? It looks like someone who's structured by these stable dispositions. Faith, which enables us to relax. Hope, which enables us from a position of relaxedness to start to be able to be stretched towards that which is coming upon us. And I think that those are the two key moments, if you like. One has to think of two emotional correlates that go along with the stable disposition. Faith leads to relaxation, and hope, once we're relaxed, enables us to be stretched. If someone doesn't have faith, stretching is just producing tension, just stressing them. Yeah? It's a form of emotion, it's part of the emotional blackmail package. But once a person is relaxed into knowing their love, then finding themselves able to be stretched into doing more than they thought they could do, into being able to take on more than they thought they could take on, into being excited about more that is coming upon them than they had thought. That's what the disposition called hope looks like in the life of a son or daughter. And this is the more important thing, as I say, typically we imagine this business of sonship is in one column, then faith, hope, and charity, yes, we know those are virtues, that's in another column, and then of course all that's nice enough, but really it's all about behavior, so morals, which is in this column. So ultimately, yes, that faith stuff is very nice. That sonship stuff is very nice. Yes, so we're all children of God. But really, when it comes down to it, behave! It's all to do with morals. And far too often presentations of Christianity do that. We talk about how Jesus died to pay for our sins, and that was very nice, and now we've got to accept that, and if we don't, we're ungrateful, and now behave. Yeah? Unfortunately, that's very often a version of Christianity. But no. The notion of our sonship or daughterhood in God is structured from within by these three theological virtues. The stable dispositions that give shape to our life as sons and daughters, therefore heirs, people who are becoming insiders on the life of God, which means being stretched into being, how would you say this, vanguard pushers of the limits in everything that is, being on the cutting edge of creation, being stretched towards everything that is. Being a son or a daughter of God doesn't mean something nice and emotional. It means discovering ourselves on the cutting edge of the opening up of everything that is. That's what creation is about. So these are the dispositions of being the heir of the owner, and therefore the one who's actually coming into their inheritance. And the gift of love is, because we are loved, actually being able to give ourselves away in love with daring. If you know you're liked, if you know you're loved, if you're up to being stretched, then you're in a position whereby you can let go of yourself because you know you're loved, can give yourself away, and not fear, because you know that you will in fact, in your giving yourself away, be given to be someone much, much more than you thought you could be. So that's the correlate for charity. Now tell me how to behave. No. If you are an insider who is being stretched with excitement into what is coming upon you, then you're discovering what it would be right and good to do is part of your exercising bairndom. Yeah? Does that make sense? So I wanted to bring that out because typically our anthropology doesn't encourage us to remember that. It has offstage faith, somehow rather intellectual, very diminished hope, very will-oriented, command-oriented love, and no sense of us being the insider with being given by God the disposition, having breathed into us the stable dispositions that enable us to be stretched into everything that is. Now, having given that as a sort of an introduction, I'm going to ask our friends who have copies of handouts to offer you a handout. We have carefully placed people, wonderfully placed, who will give you a handout. And we're going to start to look at some New Testament texts with which you are doubtless familiar. Actually, I'd quite like to copy myself when I come to it. I'll get one of them. One more come. Just a couple of quick points about this while you're getting them. Trying to explore the meaning of hope is somewhat new for me, and one of the surprises that I had while looking up and studying this material was quite how few of the words St. Paul in particular uses, and then the people in the New Testament probably borrowing from him, like the author to the Epistle of the Hebrews, quite how few of the words are in classical Greek, or even in the Greek of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint. They were either coined by him or very close to him in time. And they're all words which suggest an excitement of something that can't quite be expressed in ordinary language. So let's remember that when St. Paul was writing letters, he wasn't writing complicated documents to be read by experts and people with doctorates. He was writing excited acts of communication that forced him to stretch language beyond what it could mean. And it's amazing how, particularly when it comes to issues surrounding hope, a number of the words are words that can't be found anywhere else. In other words, he's had to invent them, stretch them, produce new forms, which is what exciting writing does. Shakespeare did it the whole time. But if you like, it suggests that there's a real excitement. There's something new about this quality that he's describing that the old words simply won't do. So what we're looking at, in a sense, is the wine bursting out of the old wineskin in the words here. On the front page, which you've got here, I've put together two chunks, Romans 5, 1-5, and Hebrews 10, 19-25. Is that what you've got? Yep, excellent. I put them together because although they're by different authors, St. Paul and somebody influenced by St. Paul, almost certainly, and have a slightly different approach, they're structured in the same way. Let's just see how this structure works. In both cases, it starts with, and I'll ask you to imagine this spatially, if you can. Some of you more accustomed to meditation might prefer to close your eyes, but whether or not you think spatially or not, try to imagine, here we have a table, an altar before us. Try to imagine a presence just here. The presence just here. So therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. So imagine that just here, the Almighty. And just here, the Almighty, the same vision that Ezekiel had, the throne vision, the same vision that Isaiah had, the same vision that Daniel had, the Almighty, but with one like a son of man who had come close. Do you remember in those visions, particularly Ezekiel and Daniel? And in a sense, what is the New Testament but that vision coming into focus, so that now the Almighty and the Son of Man is there. The Son of Man is there as crucified, dead victim, who is utterly alive because death can't hold him in. The one who everybody rejected was revealed to be the living God, who is there, just there. Because he occupied that space, loving us, we no longer need fear our sins. We no longer need fear death. Because when we were at our very worst space, putting someone else into that space, it turned out that that was the space occupied by the Almighty. So, through him, we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. Because he's just there. The presence is just there. The utter aliveness of God is just there, and is there as our forgiveness. We rejoice in our hope of sharing the glory of God. We're going to be able to be stretched into the fullness of the reputation and excitement of God. In Greek, the word for glory and the word for reputation are the same word, and the opposite is shame. St. Augustine's definition of heaven, and therefore of the glory of God, is clara cum laude notitia, being addressed, being noticed with great praise, with clear praise by God. Resounding praise. That's my boy. That's my girl. The reverberation of the that's my alive. That's what the glory of God consists of, the reputation, the utterly alive, coming alive of everything that is to point up the glory of God in which we are asked to take part. And it's interesting that in Hebrews, using more priestly language, we have exactly the same place from which we start. There it is, therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the sanctuary by the blood of Jesus. What was the sanctuary? The holy place where the Almighty is just there. By the new and living way which he opened up for us through the curtain, that is through his flesh, meaning that the veil of the temple, which had indicated the beginning of materiality, has now been lived into by Jesus, so that the whole of Jesus' life going up to his death is the way into the holy place. And now he's there at the right hand of God, in the holy place. There is no longer a curtain. And we are therefore able to have our anchor of assurance in that holy place. We are being drawn into it. Since we have a great priest over the house of God, that's the crucified and risen victim, priest, altar, lamb, who is now utterly involved in God. Let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. That's the priestly version of the same thing. We know we are loved, so we can relax and we can start to stand up. Let's go back to Romans now. We've obtained access to this grace. We rejoice in our hope of sharing the glory of God. We're being pulled in. More than that, we rejoice in our sufferings. Now, I hope you'll excuse me if I'm going to be a bit of a caricature, but I'm going to go back into my British Governor-General mode. I think it's important every now and then that you should hear from a British Governor-General, just as to remind you what nonsense British Governor-Generals speak. So more than that, we rejoice in our sufferings. You know, that suffering produces endurance. You know, people need a bit of character building, really. And endurance produces character, and character produces hope. So I'm doing this for your own good, really. And hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. Well, that love bit's all very nice, but what this is really about is my punishing you so that you'll stand up. You get the... Isn't it easy to hear these words in that way? Isn't it easy? But more than that, we rejoice not in our sufferings, because the Greek word is thlipsis, tribulations. We rejoice in our tribulations, knowing that tribulations produce, it's translated here, endurance. It's a very odd word. In some translations, it's produced patience, which is even worse. Because this is a word that's not to be found in classical Greek. It's not to be found in the Septuagint. It begins to be found more or less contemporaneously with Jesus and Paul in some of the accounts of the lives of the Jewish martyrs. And it's a language that's standing up for something in the midst of tribulation. Not letting the bastards get to you. And you can tell because its reverse is hypostole, shrinking back. We normally translate that as shrinking back. But actually that word comes from sailing, from navigational terminology, bringing down the sheets, the sails, because the wind is going too hard, and I don't want to be blown too hard, so I'll bring down the sheets. The reverse of that is full rigging ahead. Does that make sense? It's interesting how many of the languages concerning hope seem to have this sense of fullness, windy notions, as it were. So more than that, we rejoice in our tribulations, knowing that tribulations produce standing up under, sticking it out under. And in this sticking it out under produces character. Well, actually, the word is docume, which means the quality of being well regarded. It's actually a passive term. Isn't it strange? In the midst of the tribulations, we find ourselves beginning to resist. And as we resist, this produces in us the quality of being well regarded. And the quality of being well regarded produces hope. Yes, I can do it. Yeah, I can stand up. And it's worth doing it. It's worth daring to do more. Do you get that sense? Do you see how different it sounds than the usual stuff about character and patience and endurance? All of which presupposes that hope is a demand for a certain sort of patience and resignation. Does that make sense? Let's have a look at the Hebrews version of the same thing. So let's draw near with a true heart, so being pulled in to the holy place, in full assurance of faith. And again, we have the word assurance. And that assurance sounds as though it's something subjective, a sense in here that I'm feeling sure of something, a feeling. But actually, once again, in the Greek text, it's pleirophoria, a very strange word. Again, one either proper to Paul or from around that time. It's a sense of being full, and phoreo is with clothes, suggestive of someone being born in full vestments, or full clothed. It's a very strange notion, but it's the reverse of being puffed up. Someone who's puffed up is there's no there, right? But pleirophoria is a fullness being borne along with what you wear. There's a strange sense of us having been filled out as we are being pulled into something bigger than ourselves. With our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. So let's hold fast, and again, the confession of our faith without hoping. This was the second thing that really surprised me about Paul's language regarding hope. It's very verbal. It's funny, isn't it, how we think of hope as an internal disposition, and yet, in St. Paul's language, it's very much to do with something that can be talked about. The sort of boldness that's referred to in the very first verse here in Hebrews, hope 19, therefore, brethren, since we have confidence, since we have boldness, it's the sort of boldness that is to do with talking, being able to speak out. There's a verbal quality to this sense of being drawn in, assured by something. So let's let's hold fast to this confession of our hope without wavering, without being pulled one way or another. It's windy language. For he who promised is faithful. And again, please notice, what is it that produces hope in us? It's assurance given by someone else. My mum's will created an assurance. My mum is dead. Actually, that's part of the assurance. Because if she were alive, she might decide that I'm not a worthy recipient of her will. But she can't change her will posthumously. That's part of the assurance, isn't it? Yes? Seems a true point. St. Paul uses this language. Whereas the whole point of Jesus having gone to his death is that the will is now established. His will is out, and we now know what God's will looks like. That we should all live together with him. But that he is a living hope. My mum is dead. She's alive in God. Jesus occupied the space of death in such a way that just there, that life is open. So he's pulling me into it. And that's the assurance. He is the one who is assuring me. Let's hold fast to the confession, the defense, the speaking out of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful. And then just to show how much this is to do with us being what Girard would refer to as mimetic creatures rather than individual ones. Again, I'll lapse back into Governor Generalese, only to put it right afterwards. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. You can imagine that. Stirring up is a gentle thing. One stirs up a soup or a pudding or something like that. No. When it says let us consider, it's much more taking notice of each other, being for each other, how would you say, instigation, incitements to hope, sparking off each other, learning from each other what we might hope in. And the idea is that because we spark it off in each other, this actually, and the Greek word is a nasty word, becoming irritants, provoking an irritant to love and good work. The Greek word is paroxysmos, paroxysm. Governor Generals don't usually try to provoke paroxysms, do they? And here is St. Paul saying, no, get yourselves all worked up. Allow yourselves to be excited, irritated into doing good things because you find yourselves pulled in. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. In other words, we're being pulled into something which is stretching us into being more than ourselves. Let's work each other up about it a bit. Does that begin to give you a sense of somewhat different set of, how would we say, somewhat different psychological picture of what's going on with hope? How long have we got? How are we doing for time? 10 minutes? Okay, good. I'd like to take a step back and have a look at part of this, what creates this disposition in us. This disposition that enables us to be stretched. The Middle Ages had a very rich understanding of the theological virtues, because they understood, as we find it very difficult to understand, that God is the protagonist of each of these dispositions. In other words, that it's God who wants to share God's life with us, and therefore produces in us an ability to share and participate in that life by different ways. To share in God's self-knowledge, that's by faith. To share in God's love, which is by charity. And for us who are time-bound creatures, to be able to share in eternity, which in principle is without time, by hope. And that's a very interesting thing, because it meant that in the Middle Ages they understood perfectly clearly that the virtue of faith was somehow related to intellect, to knowing that Aunt Mabel likes you, that the virtue of charity was some way related to will, because you are loved, finding yourself able to want to love. And they associated the virtue of hope with memory. The faculty of memory. And we think that's very odd, because for us, typically, we imagine hope as something to do with the future, and memory as something to do with the past. Wrong, said the Middle Ages, and I think that they're quite right. Because that assumes that memories are things we have. Whereas the Middle Ages was much closer to being aware of what we are now much more scientifically aware, which is that we don't have memories, memories have us. This creature, this hominoid, this scarcely more than a macaque, which we are, is particularly good at imitation and repetition. And what brings us into being as viable selves from our infancy onwards is having fired off in us the neurons that enable us to imitate, which means to repeat. One of the things that very small children do is repeat constantly, to the fury of their parents. Gestures, and then sounds, and then gradually putting together gestures and sounds and bouncing off new sounds and new gestures according as they receive positive feedback from the elders who are desperate to see whether they're going to say mama or dad first. But what is being inducted in them is the beginning of memory, which is the putting together of gesture, repeated sound, so that after a bit, they begin to be able to use the word I. And the word I does not mean that they have discovered that there is a self somewhere in there. It means they're beginning to become narratively viable within the network that has brought them into being. This body is becoming an active node, if you like, within a network. It's becoming able to negotiate with the we which has brought it into being. So that our memory is what produces the possibility over time for there to be a viable self. And we know that very clearly when we meet elderly friends or relatives with Alzheimer's or who have suffered total amnesia. They have to be held by others. Is that not true? It's not that they have forgotten things, but their memory does not hold them any longer as a viable self. That body has become a node that other people need to negotiate the place in the we. Is that a fair? Now, why is this so important when it comes to the gift of hope? Because it's because of memory that we are able to make sense of time, the movement that is time. And that we are actually able to have a present in a rich way. When you came here this evening, you came here from somewhere, and afterwards you're going somewhere. You have memories of what you were doing before, and you have hopes or plans of some sort for what you're going to be doing later this evening, if it's dinner or coffee or a good night's sleep or whatever. But you didn't expect to be here forever. You're not locked into an eternal present of listening to the dreadful James Allison in Pitt Street Church. That would be an infernal punishment. You are present. Within the narrative story that you have made of your past up till now, you find yourself able to be here in a certain way with certain tendency towards the future. And as you listen to me, that present is where you are. The interesting thing is that your ability to imagine the future is very, very much related to the extent to which you are bound to certain elements of your past. If we're bound in certain ways to our past, there are things we can't imagine. If we're tied within certain forms of rivalry and vengeance towards people in our past, it closes us down with relation to the possibilities of imagination of the future. And that means that who we are at the present is less capable of enjoying what is. The extraordinary thing about the gift of hope is that it presupposes, as I said, the one who is just there, who is not only just there as the utterly living, alive, effervescent one, but the utterly alive, effervescent one as forgiveness, which means letting go. So that as we come into the presence, we find our memories undone. Facts are not altered. But if someone else is telling quite a different story with the same facts, we are tied into them in quite different ways. We find ourselves being able to receive who we are in a quite different way, which opens us up towards imagining a quite different future. And that strange work with the memory, which undoes, that's all forgiveness means, letting go of the past to open up the future, is what enables an ever richer presence. And this, I think, is the key thing to remember with the gift of hope. It's not particularly about the future. It's how the Eternal One, blessed be He, enables us, time-ridden, time-bound, time-constructed creatures. Because we would have no narrative without time. We would have no sense of presence without time. Hope is how time is enabled to construct us and hold us in such a way that we can be present and therefore actually capable of enjoying God. It's the gift of time building up presence for participation. And that's really what I wanted to leave you with. The wonderful gift of redeeming the time. Thank you very much indeed.